Hi, well in this talk we're going to look at one of the most courageous women in the whole of the Old Testament. Our story starts with a king. His name is Ahasuerus. He was the king of Persia. Now Persian kings were known by their titles rather than their names, and our king is known as the Persian king Xerxes. You know, the Persian Empire was huge. You can see from this map that it covered as far west as Egypt and Libya. It included Turkey and crossed into parts of Greece, up into the Balkans. Eastwards it reached into India. It was the largest area of any empire in history up to that point, 2.1 million square miles. Its major cities were Susa, Persepolis and Babylon. It had an amazing administration with a good road system, a postal system, civil servants, universities, and so it went on, very advanced. Although they had a professional army that could deal ruthlessly with enemies, they were on the whole good overlords and looked after the people within their territories, unlike the preceding empires of Assyria and Babylon. Now a bit of background. In 605 BC, the Jewish people had been largely exiled by the Babylonians, and a few remained in Israel, and those few would intermarry with surrounding peoples, and they became known as the Samaritans, which we read about in the New Testament and elsewhere. By now the walls of Jerusalem and most of the temple had been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, and around 70 years later, in 539 BC, the first Persian king, Cyrus the Great, walked in and took Babylon without a fight. It wasn't difficult, as the princes of Babylon had become so unpopular and despised by many of the people that they gratefully accepted Cyrus. And just 1 year later, after being crowned, Cyrus released many Jews to return and rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. Many went, 50,000 or so, but most didn't. But the majority of Jews, 97.5% of the Jews, over 2 million, remained. And although they had not assimilated, more about that a bit later, they had settled throughout the empire, become comfortable. They'd settled particularly in the major cities. Now our story starts 60 or so years later. So the 50,000 had gone back and more. And it's to do with these Jews that remained. They remained, but they remained distinct as a people, dispersed around the Persian Empire. And the story starts with the king enthroned at his city of Shushan, or Susa, it's more often known as, in modern-day Iran. It was an extraordinary citadel, as you can see in these photographs. An amazing place, extraordinary buildings. The king had decided to show off, and for 180 days he invited all the nobles of the realm to come from far and wide to view his wealth and splendour. And at the end of those 6 months he held a 7-day feast for all of them, including all of the inhabitants of the city of Susa. And if you read the story, you'll notice the opulence of the occasion, the wealth and money that was splashed out. Now the king had a wife. Her name was Vashti, and Jewish writings have her as the great-granddaughter of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II. We don't know for sure. And on the 7th day of the feast, we're told that the king was merry with drink. Well, we can only just imagine what that means. He ordered 7 of his eunuchs to bring Vashti before the assembled people so that he could show off her beauty. And understandably, she refused to go. The king was enraged, and he took counsel, and he was advised that he should never again allow Vashti into his presence, and to make her an example for other women. She was treated terribly. Now sometime later his advisors suggested that the king needed a new wife, and that he should hold what was effectively a beauty competition. How bad is that? And the most beautiful girls from the realm would be invited. Now we come to our next member of the cast, a man called Mordecai. Incidentally, relatively recently, references to Mordecai have been found on numerous Persepolis stone treasury tablets, and they relate precisely to this time. And we do know that later on Mordecai would go on to the highest of government positions in the empire. So it should be no surprise, I guess. Now Mordecai was Jewish. He was from the tribe of Benjamin. He lived in the city of Susa, and he was from royal lineage. There are some historical writings that give his genealogy back to Jonathan and King Saul. And this same genealogy is inscribed on a large tablet at the traditional tomb of both Mordecai and Esther. Now Mordecai had an uncle. His name was Abihail, and he had died, and he left an orphaned young daughter whom Mordecai raised as his own daughter. Her Hebrew name was Hadassah. Jews also took on Persian names, and in this case she was known under the Persian name of Esther. And Esther was beautiful, and she found herself one of the women selected to attend this beauty pageant. And Mordecai was worried about her. Before she was taken, he warned Esther not to reveal that she was Jewish. Anti-Semitism goes back a long way. And it says that every day he would pace backwards and forwards in front of the women's court, hoping to hear about the welfare of his precious daughter. It took 12 months for the women to be prepared before they were brought before the king, so Mordecai must have done an awful lot of pacing. Now eventually she was taken before the king, and the king found great favour in her. And it says that he loved her more than all the others, and so another feast was arranged. A public holiday was announced throughout the provinces, and still she did not tell the king that she was Jewish. And so the king found a new wife. Now sometime later on, Mordecai would hear of a plot by two of the king's eunuchs who sought to attack the king. And Mordecai got word to Queen Esther, who informed the king of the plot, and an inquiry was held, and it was all found to be true, and the two culprits were hanged. This is quite an important part of our story for later on. Now we come to yet another participant in the story, a man most likely descended from Agag. Agag was an old Amalekite king. Do you remember the Amalekites who battled with Moses and the Israelites after they left Egypt? And the name of our new man is Haman. And 3 years after Esther was named queen, he was promoted to chief minister. He was a king's favourite who ruled over every other prince in the empire. And the king had declared that all people that entered the king's gate should now bow down to Haman. But Mordecai refused to bow down, and some servants of the king noticed that he would not bow down, and they challenged him. And it says that they spoke to him daily about it. And each time he refused to bow down, saying that he was a Jew and he would not bow down. And the servants asked Haman himself if being a Jew was a legitimate reason not to bow down. And Haman was filled with rage, and he sought to destroy not only Mordecai but all of the Jews in the whole empire. And he went to the king. He said, there are certain people in the kingdom who are different. Their laws are different, and they don't keep the king's laws. It is not fitting for you to let them remain. Give me permission to destroy these people. And to the king's shame, he sealed it and agreed. He sealed it with his ring, and he gave Haman all the money that he needed for this undertaking. A decree was written and sent out to the provincial heads. They were called satraps. And the decree stated that all Jews, young and old, were to be killed on a particular day, the 13th day of the 12th month, and that all of their goods were to be plundered by the people. The king was happy with this order, we're told, but it says that the people were perplexed. They couldn't understand why. Across the whole empire, the Jews now put on sackcloth and ashes, and they mourned. Mordecai even did this outside of the king's gate. Now Esther had not heard this news, and she didn't know about the decree, and she saw Mordecai in sackcloth, and she was distressed, and she sent new clothes to her beloved uncle. But he refused to wear them, so she got a message to him, and now she heard the news herself, and Mordecai managed to get her a copy of the written decree. And the message back to her said, make supplication to the king for all of your people. Well, she got a message back to Mordecai that if anyone enters the king's inner court without an invite, they're put to death, and that would include her. Mordecai's reply was tough, but it ripples down the ages. Do not think in your heart that you will escape the king's decree any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews, but from another place, and you and your father's household will perish. But who knows, maybe you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. And Esther replied, okay, go and gather all of the Jews who are present in Susa and fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days. My maids and I will fast likewise, and so I will go to the king. And if I perish, then I perish. 3 days later, with great courage, she entered the king's court. Fortunately, the king found favour in her and asked her what she wanted. He even said to her, ask for half my kingdom if you want, and I'll give it to you. What she actually requested was for the king and for Haman to attend a banquet of wine that very day that she'd prepared for them. And it says the king was pleased to do just this. And at her banquet, the king once again said, what do you wish of me? Even if it's half my kingdom, you'll have it. And she replied, let the king and Haman come to yet another banquet that I've prepared for tomorrow. Well, Haman was delighted. He went home and he boasted how the queen had invited him and him alone, no other nobles, to attend with the king, and that there'd be another banquet the next day. But he also said to his family, I remain angered as that Jew Mordecai remains at the king's gate. Haman's wife and some other friends told him, build a huge gallows over 70 feet high, and then Mordecai can hang on it, and you'll be cheered up. Now that very night the king could not sleep, so decided to read about the chronicles of his kingdom, and by miraculous coincidence he read about how Mordecai had saved him those years earlier. And in the morning he asked his attendants, did we ever honour Mordecai for his great deed? No, his attendants replied. Now at that very moment Haman entered the court to propose the hanging of Mordecai. However, immediately the king said to Haman, what shall we do to the man who brings me delight? Now, assuming that the question was about himself, Haman answered, for the man whom the king delights to honour, let a royal robe be bought which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on its head. Then let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honour, and then parade him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honour. Good idea, the king thought. Do everything that you have proposed to Mordecai who sits in the gate. Haman must have choked on his own bile. But he did what the king asked of him, and then he went home angry and in despair. Now at that very moment the attendant arrived to take Haman to the second banquet. Now again at the banquet the king asked Esther what was it she desired, and she replied, if I have found favour in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be spared and the lives of my people. For we've been sold to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Had we simply been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue. Who's done this? The king demanded. The adversary is this Haman, a wicked man, she replied. And Haman was hung on his own gallows. Well, Esther was given all the possessions of Haman. She told the king how she was related to Mordecai, and the signet ring was taken from Haman's hand and put on Mordecai's finger. And a new decree that would save the Jewish people was written personally by Esther and Mordecai at the command of the king. The Jews were to be slaughtered on the 13th day of the 12th month. Instead, the 14th and 15th days of the month were declared days of rest and feasting for the Jews. A day when they had rest from their enemies. A day when sorrow was turned to joy and laughter. And so the Jewish feast of Purim commenced. Now the queen and her dear uncle that had cared for her nearly all her life wrote to the Jews that they should never forget this day and this feast of Purim. What an amazing story. And what can we learn from it? Well, just a few things from me. I'm sure there's much more. Firstly, as a Gentile believer, I and all Gentiles are indebted to the Jews. All but one of the writers of our Bibles were Jewish. Jesus was and is today a Jewish man born of a Jewish woman, Mary. And the Bible tells us that salvation is of the Jews. There are many, many Messianic Jews who have discovered their Messiah, Jesus. And we've been grafted into that Jewish family. We've not replaced the Jews. Our Bible is very clear about this. And the devil hates it. And it's no surprise that so many in the world hate the Jews because the ruler of this world, Satan himself, hates them and wants to destroy them. I'd love to ask you a question, with a small challenge perhaps. Ask God what he thinks of his people, the Jewish people, who are far from perfect, by the way. And ask him if your own attitude towards them is in line with his. Now we know that not all Jews will be saved. You need to trust in Jesus for that. But many do. And one day many more will. When Jesus returns and they look upon his face, whom they crucified, and realize the tragedy of the ages, that their own Messiah was amongst them, and so many have missed it. We're told that a nation will be born in a day when they look on his face. But we owe our own salvation to the fact that many did not miss his arrival. Remember this, that the Jews did not kill Jesus. They went along with it. The Romans did not kill Jesus. His death was a plan of salvation drawn up by the Father and the Son themselves. It was God's idea and God's plan. Over the ages, the church has been wicked in its treatment of the Jewish people and the Jewish nation. But God has not divorced them, and he never will. He said that. He never will. We have not replaced God's people. We've been grafted in as wild olive branches, and we thank God for the wonderful mercy and kindness that has been extended to us as aliens to be able to be grafted in. Secondly, we can see from this book that God uses anyone that is courageous enough to take a risk. And Esther was an orphan with little or no future, but she was willing to take a risk. She did not take foolish risks, and they fasted and prayed for 3 days and nights beforehand, but she did take a risk. She inclined her ear to the Lord before doing it, but she still went ahead and did it courageously. And God loves that sort of courageous character, the sort of person that puts their trust in him completely. Thirdly, when the Jews were in exile, it became very important to them that they remained distinct, that they remained God's people, that they did not disappear into other nations through total assimilation. History has proven over time that an exiled people virtually always assimilate and disappear. How would they ensure this did not happen to them? And the answer lay in Bible study. This generated a need for skilled Bible teachers. They were called the Sopharim, men who caused people to understand the scriptures. And foremost among these teachers was a man called Ezra. Ezra was a contemporary of Esther's, born about 30 years before our story, and he founded what was called the Great Assembly. And these teachers would illuminate God's word and ensure that the people knew whose people they were through sound Bible teaching. And the same is true today. It's easy to assimilate. Maybe in our desire to reach the world, we start to become like the world. Maybe we just slowly adopt the values of the world around us. The reason the gospel is a message of hope is because it is different. It offers a different life with a different hope and a different joy based on a different truth and a different kind of love, agape love. We must be seen to be different, not the same. The answer is never assimilation but differentiation. We're to be an alternative, and what an amazing alternative it is, thanks to the sacrifice of our Messiah who has redeemed us at such a great personal price. And finally, we take great encouragement that as God has preserved his people in this book, as we see it, so he too can and does preserve us. We thank him for his loving kindness. We heard that their sorrow was turned into joy, and Jesus came to turn mourning into gladness. I love that word, gladness. He's given us a spirit of gladness. It is amazing that when he returns again, he will wipe away every tear and our gladness will reach its full maturity. I can't wait for the day. Let's be ready for our Messiah. God bless.